Thank you. Good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm Director of Academic Affairs here at NASER, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. Thank you for joining us, whether in person or online. Tonight's program is the third annual Vartan Gregorian Memorial Lecture. As I hope you all know, those of you who are here in person, you are in the NASER Vartan Gregorian building, named in his honor. And at the grand opening of which we had the privilege of having him present nearly 5 years ago, next week. Vartan Gregorian, 1934 to 2021, was born in Tabriz, Iran, and received his secondary education at the Collège Arménien Jamaran in Beirut, Lebanon. And he graduated from and received a PhD in History and Humanities from Stanford University. After an academic career spanning 2 decades, including a period as Cartozian Professor of Armenian and Caucasian History at the University of Pennsylvania, Vartan served as President of the New York Public Library, President of Brown University, and President of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. An extremely distinguished career, to say the very least. In this memorial lecture series, we endeavor to select topics that resonate with Vartan's areas of interest, which, fortunately for us, were expansive. Among them were issues relating to immigration and citizenship. He spoke and wrote about the topics often, and as president of the Carnegie Corporation, he developed programs to advance immigrant naturalization and civic integration. In 2018, Vartan wrote that, quote, "America invested in me and saw me as a citizen. It is a debt that I can never fully repay, though I have tried." Today, immigrants remind us more than ever of what is right about America. By going to such lengths to become American, they honor those of us lucky enough to be born American, he wrote. We are also reminded, he did not write, and I say, that it was not necessarily always so, and that at times America went to great lengths to make it difficult to become American. And 100 years ago, to what extent Armenian immigrants could or would be seen as citizens hung in the balance. This, then, is where tonight's speaker, Dr. Zeynep Devrim Gürsel, Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rutgers University, comes into the picture. Nearly 5 years ago, in December 2019, I had the good fortune to receive an email from her saying that she was in Cambridge and would I have time to meet. I already knew a little about her work, but was unprepared for the sensory overload produced by our long conversation that day about her remarkable project, Portraits of Unbelonging, which she has now been engaged in for the past decade, and which involves researching Terki Tabiyet photographs, which are expatriation photographs taken of Ottoman Armenians between 1896 and 1908 to permit their emigration from the Ottoman Empire, but to prevent their return to the Ottoman Empire. This work has led her across the US to meet with descendants of those photographed and to learn what became of the families she first encountered in the Ottoman archives. And it has resulted in several excellent academic articles and numerous public talks, including one of the early NASER webinars in summer 2020 in the depths of the pandemic lockdown. Those were the days. One of those articles, classifying the Cartozians, appeared in the journal Photographies, and it follows the Cartozian family from their sitting for an Ottoman expatriation photograph in 1906 to their use of advertising and portrait photography in the US, to their central role in a landmark legal case. But now I am stepping on our speaker's toes, and she will tell you the rest. Lastly, before I relinquish the lectern, a couple of things. One, we're very happy to have present tonight with us our friend and also great-granddaughter of Tateios Cartozian, about whom much more presently, our friend Carla Garapetian. Carla, thank you for being here tonight. It's a wonderful coincidence and great to have you with us. We're also very happy to have with us Vartan Gregorian's nephew, our friend Ara Kelian, and thank you, Ara, for being here, and I hope perhaps some of his sons may be watching online, and if you are, welcome, friends. We will have Q&A following the talk on Zoom. Please use the Zoom Q&A function. Here in the room, please amble up to the microphone and speak into it. And now, our speaker, Zeynep Gürsel. Zeynep. Welcome.
Thank you.
You will position the microphone appropriately, I'm sure.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you to everybody online. And I will get going. Thank you for this very kind introduction, Mark. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I currently live and work in New Jersey, which means that I live and work on land that belongs to the Lenni Lenape people. I acknowledge their continuing relationship with their territory. This land acknowledgement is not mere preamble for me. I've spent the last several years, actually a decade as Mark just reminded me, trying to understand processes and repercussions of unbelonging from a homeland, whether one interprets homeland as a territory or social fabric or legal ties to a state. I've also wondered what land acknowledgement might look like in post-Ottoman territories such as Istanbul, my hometown, or Eastern Anatolia, which I will be talking more about today. This is a very special talk for me, not only because I'm very happy to be able to give a talk at Nasser in person after having given one in 2020 online, but also because it's truly a great honor to give the Vartan Gregorian lecture. I very much wish I could have met Mr. Gregorian and spent time conversing with him. And to be clear, this is not something most academics say about most administrators. But I believe Mr. Gregorian was always, first of all, a passionate student and a dedicated teacher. From his writings, I gleaned that he had a great sense of humor and he appreciated stories. So it is in that spirit that I've organized the talk today. Let me begin by situating us in the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century during the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II from 1876 to 1909. Now, by any standards, the period in question was a critical and tumultuous one. Part of this political turmoil stemmed from tentative and often violent nation-building projects, both within and on the borders of the Ottoman Empire, as well as an influx of refugees, mostly Muslim refugees from the Caucasus and the Balkans, both of which led to significant changes in the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional landscapes of the empire. Ottoman nationality at the time was suspended somewhere between subjecthood and citizenship. Sultan Abdülhamid's reign began in 1876 with him reluctantly accepting the first Ottoman constitution, only to then suspend it and the parliament for the next 29 years. His reign ended with his being forced to allow elections and the reopening of parliament, which nevertheless failed to prevent his deposition in 1909. Now, a time of suspension between subjecthood and citizenship is a very interesting moment in which to consider photography, since even when they depict types or groups, photographs always index specific individuals. So as the contours of Ottoman subjecthood were changing, at what moments did subjects become photographed individuals for the eyes of the state? This was a time of immense photographic activity in the empire. I've just pulled up some examples for you here. Abdülhamid II dispatched photographers to the four corners of his empire and asked that they produce interior and exterior photographs of all important buildings, such as municipal buildings, prisons, hospitals, schools, police stations. The resulting archive consists of some 35,000 photographs mostly bound in albums. It documents imperial projects such as the modernization of military and government facilities, Ottoman healthcare and manufacturing, massive engineering projects such as the building of railways and bridges, educational reform, and cityscapes. And it also includes a large collection of police photographs. So I'm telling you this to give you a background of how I came to portraits of unbelonging in the first place. From medical imagery to prison portraiture, my key question has always been, under what conditions were individuals brought into photographic visibility? This talk tracks the role photography and other images played in a transnational Asian family history shaped by the power of the state to confer categories of belonging and unbelonging. So 2 photographs of the Ottoman Armenian Cartozian family show not only when and how they were brought into visibility for the state, but they also underscore the stakes of both their visibility and invisibility. The first portrait was taken in the Enkababian photography studio for the Ottoman state, and it's dated May 17th, 1906. It was taken before they emigrated to the United States from what U.S. ship manifests refer to as Turkey in Asia. The second photograph, which might be more familiar to you, was published in the Oregonian newspaper in 1924 after Tateios Cartozian's naturalization on May 17, 1923, as a U.S. citizen. After his naturalization was challenged in federal court on the grounds that he, and by proxy all Armenians, were Asiatic and hence racially ineligible for U.S. citizenship. I look at these 2 photographs of the Cartozian family alongside the advertising imagery for the Cartozian brothers' Oriental rug business based in Portland, Oregon, in order to compare images of the Cartozians with imagery produced by the Cartozians. As I will show, the Cartozians used advertising imagery to masterfully negotiate processes of inclusion and exclusion imposed by U.S. citizenship laws. These 2 examples of a single family's photographic representation demonstrate, in turn, a larger point, namely that the serious study of photography can open unexpectedly revealing new vistas into other fields of study, in this case, transnational migration and the state processes through which subjects are granted and denied citizenship. I will be discussing both Ottoman expatriation and American naturalization as processes of exclusion. Okay, so let me repeat that. I'm talking about both Ottoman expatriation processes and American naturalization processes as processes of exclusion, processes in which the state polices a boundary around nationality by determining who can be allowed to leave or enter not only a geographic territory, but also a polity. Now, while naturalization in U.S. citizenship might appear to be a bureaucratic process of inclusion, a process of folding foreigners into the U.S. polity, the restriction of this right to, quote, free white persons in the very first national document concerning citizenship, written in 1790, meant that naturalization was always also a process of exclusion. This exclusionary process is clearest in 52 what are called racial prerequisite cases that were settled by state and federal courts between 1878 and 1952. So who was and who was not to be considered white, as well as the very grounds on what whiteness was repeatedly debated. and tracing the Cartozian family from the Oregon East to the American West allows us to think about visibility and invisibility vis-a-vis different kinds of states, as this family's migration was not merely geographic, but also across incommensurable state structures. What do I mean by that? They moved from an empire to a republic. Yet while the nature of the state in the Ottoman Empire and the United States was very different, in both contexts, the Cartozians had to negotiate their visibility to the state at a time when the very definition of nationality and citizenship were in flux. So the photograph of Tatos Cartozian and his family is clearly identified as an expatriation photograph. The back of the print housed in the Ottoman State Archives today states clearly that on May 17, 1906, the portrait was processed for the family's expatriation and emigration to America on the explicit condition of never returning to the empire. The photograph shows Tateos Cartozian and his wife Haykana, and their 3 children, his son Vahan and his daughters Fındık, who later went by Hazel, and Agavni Ori. On the verso, in the hand of an Ottoman official, are listed each person's birth year, residence, and relationship to Tateos, the anchoring male head of household, and their name as understood and written in Ottoman script, hence Cartozolu rather than Cartozian. The Cartozian family was from Sebastia in the Ottoman East. So here you can see I've translated what is on the back for you, and you see it explicitly says that the photograph was taken to emigrate to America, having expatriated and never returned to the empire. Sebastia you can see here on this map, and what I've done is the green dots are the towns from which the majority of migrants left, right? Places like Harpert, Bitlis, Sebastia, Garin. And the blue dots are the ports from which they left. Now, the Cartozian portrait I just shared with you was sent from Sebastia to Istanbul in a batch of 3 copies each of 31 portraits during the summer of 1906. So this was a big batch of photographs. It would have been in a stack like this one, and 1 copy would have been archived in the police files, 1 copy in the Ministry of Interior, and a 3rd print sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, in the same portrait, in the same bundle, the portrait immediately above Tateos Cartozian's family portrait on the left here belonged to Tateos Cartozian's cousin, who you see on the far right. And a couple above that photograph showed his mother and younger brothers Haik and Hofsep, who you see in the central photograph here. This process of expatriation was called terk-i tabiyet. Abandonment of nationality is the sort of literal translation. It was called terk-i tabiyet in Ottoman law, and this particular joint emigration expatriation pathway was opened in 1896 by a legal decree applicable to Armenians exclusively. So between 1896 and 1908, when the process was terminated, at least 4,300 Ottoman Armenians emigrated abroad through the expatriation process, and were photographed similar to the Cartozians. Terk-i tabiyet was not an expulsion order, but a bureaucratic process of exclusion. So in contrast to the expulsions that would take place in 1915, these families were not forcibly deported. The 1896 amendment applied only to Armenians, but it included all Armenians, Catholics, Protestants, and those belonging to the Apostolic Church. It offered them the right to expatriate, but in doing so, they would give up forever the right to return. So the required expatriation photographs brought these Protestant Cartozians into visibility for the Ottoman state as Armenian subjects. The operative category here was ethnic rather than racial. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, and I know this is legal technicalities, but they happen to really matter in this particular case. In the United States, expatriation was declared a right. And it was not racialized. The Expatriation Act of 1868 recognized any individual's right to expatriate from any state into which they were born, thereby establishing a legal right by which those abroad could arrive on American shores and claim to have left behind obligations to other nations or empires, right? So in contrast, there were two systems that saw expatriation very differently. In the US, it was seen as a right that anybody had, whereas within the Ottoman Empire, expatriation was a privilege that only the Sultan could grant. The Ottoman state's primary concern was preventing return migration to the empire by Armenians who had naturalized in the United States for fear that they might engage in political activities and then claim extraterritorial legal privileges. An expatriation photograph, then, is not only a family portrait, but a formal step in the expatriation process through which the individual's relationship with the Ottoman state is severed. Though the activation of the shutter often precedes the families being issued passports by days or weeks, the portraits produced are already what I call portraits of unbelonging. They're portraits taken to bring individuals into state visibility for the purpose of their exclusion. These images do not visualize citizenship, they visualize the severance of nationality. So these photographic subjects are no longer Ottoman subjects. The subjects were issued passports that granted mobility but prevented return. And I'm very excited tonight to show you Tadeusz Cartozian's passport. I believe you may be the very first audience who has ever seen this passport, and it is thanks to the generosity of Carla Garapedian that I'm able to share this with you. And Tadeusz Cartozian, like all those emigrants leaving through Tarkitabiet, was issued this passport granting him and his family mobility but preventing return. So what does that look like in practice? Here you can see under the delivery date I'm showing you the French side of the passport where in the parentheses it says, hitherto they may not return to the empire. So it's written right onto the passport. So the individuals were given the passports and the state kept the photographs, right? So in the empire's capital, in the archives of state institutions, there was this growing archive of former Ottoman subjects who now existed as likenesses only. Their portraits of unbelonging rendered them visible in anticipation of a surveillance apparatus intended to recognize and eject them should they attempt to return. Now, I want to stop a minute and have you think about how much technology is required for something similar to be working today, and state the obvious, which is in the absence of a computerized database of images, the state was not yet fully capable of enacting their exclusion should these Armenian emigrants return. But the images and their archival collection materialized an aspiration. Right? In 10 years, I have not come across a single story of someone actually being recognized by their photograph upon their return. The shadow of another print on the back of Tadeusz Cartozian's Portrait of Unbelonging suggests that once it arrived in Istanbul, these images remained tightly stacked for a long time and eventually became ghosts of a former empire that appear not to have been looked at for a very long time. Now, Armenian migration abroad from the Ottoman East was a direct consequence of the anti-Armenian violence that escalated between the years 1894 and 1897. I'm going to switch to another photograph of the Cartozian family, again provided to us this evening by Carla Garapetian, because here you see the family circa 1900, so about 6 years before they emigrated. And it's a family portrait in the sense that it's the whole family taken together, not broken up and into separate portraits by male head of household. The Cartozian family had felt the impact of the anti-Armenian violence very directly. Tadeusz's father, Oskan, was killed in a massacre in the Sebastia Bazaar. A note in the opening pages of the Cartozian Family Bible gives the date of his death as October 31st, 1895. Yet the family did not flee right away, nor when the 1896 amendment first made it possible legally to do so. Rather, perhaps to mitigate financial and other risks, or perhaps by other necessities, the Cartozian family emigrated in stages. Aram was the first of the brothers to leave for the United States, departing from the port of Samsun in December 1903. 3 years later, his mother arrived, accompanied by his brothers Tadeusz, Haig, and Hofsep Cartozian and their families. They traveled with several other families from Sebastia, whose photographs had also been in that thick bundle sent to Istanbul in the summer of 1906. Within months of his brother's arrival, Aram Cartozian left New York and moved to Portland, Oregon, where he established a carpet business under the family name. Tadeusz and Hofsep soon joined him, and they all worked together in the family carpet business. The Cartozian brothers advertised their business right from the start. You can see the first ad is 1907, and the business was established in 1906. And they advertised with great regularity in the state's paper of record, which was the Portland Oregonian, but also the Oregon Journal and the Oregon Voter, weekly magazine of citizenship. The first ad from 1907 has Aram O. Cartozian himself identified as, quote, a native weaver. Within 5 years, the focus of the advertisements shifted from being native repairers of carpets with a few fine rugs for sale to having, quote, the largest collection of rare and antique masterpieces ever shown on the Pacific coast. Later advertisements emphasized that their oldest brother, Philippos, still in Sebastia, was sourcing the carpets. By the 1920s, the advertisements focused on the vast number of looms owned by the Cartozians and highlights their role as, quote, transferring Oriental rugs from native weavers to American homes. These frequent newspaper ads advertised then not only the carpets, but also the family behind the business. The Cartozian brothers advertised itself as both a trustworthy family business run by brothers and a transnational organization, right, that could guarantee selection and low prices because they had tremendous reach. Papers across Oregon, as well as Montana and Idaho, carried ads with camel imagery announcing that the Cartozian brothers of Portland would be visiting their local department store. Now, a kneeling camel image, head held high, soon became their brand logo, and it was frequently accompanied by text that underscored the stability of their business, established in 1906. The sign of the camel was chosen to signal authenticity in America and evoke an Oriental atmosphere, to conjure the Silk Road trade caravans. They made a point of instructing their clients on how to read their symbol, right? Quote, "It is our business sign and your assurance that the rugs housed here are genuine Persian Oriental rugs." One 1920 ad focused entirely on the sign of the kneeling camel, symbol of the Oriental virtues of humbleness and patience. Yet there was no attempt, as you can probably see, to authentically represent an actual Asian town. Hence, the camel is merely one of the imagined exotic elements of the fantastical Orient portrayed in the Cartozian ads. Now, they even had a special delivery truck decorated with the sign of the camel, right? And please notice the hood ornament, which is also the kneeling camel, complete, and this is brilliant, complete with a custom-made light built over the sign so that it would be visible even when delivering carpets at night. This delivery truck itself, no surprise, became a news item in the Oregonian in 1919, right? Rug dealers' hand-painted delivery car attracts wide attention. From 1916 onwards, the Cartozian brothers sold their Oriental rugs from an address that was itself a marker of prestige, the Pittock Block building. The Pittock Block took up an entire city block in Portland, Oregon. It stood 8 stories tall and had the city's first substation built for Northwestern Electric Company. Cartozian brothers were one of the original tenants, and they leased one of the most prominent storefronts on Washington Street. It's right here on the corner. I'll show you a close-up in a second. The store was 75 by 38 feet, with a basement that was even a little bit larger, as well as a workshop and a washing plant. Hence, the Cartozians associated their business with both a distant, exotic Orient, while simultaneously establishing themselves in one of Portland's most recognizably prestigious locations. So here's the close-up, and I hope you can see, I don't know if right here is where the Cartozian brothers' store was. Eventually, all of the Cartozian brothers filed declarations of intention to naturalize. According to the 1790 Naturalization Act, as I said before, citizenship in the United States was open to free white men of good character. So in theory, all those born in the United States, except Native Americans, were automatically granted citizenship and considered natural-born citizens. Others could naturalize once they had been in the United States long enough to prove themselves to be of good character. Others, that is, who met the racial prerequisite established by the 1790 Naturalization Act, a prerequisite that was not lifted until 1952. Following the Civil War, Congress extended racial eligibility for naturalization to aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. So after 1870, white did not mean, in a racial prerequisite case, white was not the opposite of black, but rather the opposite of Asian. It just meant non-Asian or non-Native American. In 1878, when determining the very first racial prerequisite case and declaring that the Chinese appellant was ineligible for citizenship, the judge explicitly stated, quote, "Congress retained the word white in the naturalization laws for the sole purpose of excluding the Chinese from the right of naturalization. Not only were Chinese ineligible for citizenship, but a series of laws began to curtail or ban their entry into the United States altogether. In 1882, what became known as the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers into the United States. Yet no explicit legal exclusions were made concerning the immigration or naturalization of many other groups, such as Afghans, Arabs, Armenians, Indians, Turks, Syrians, Iranians. Deciding whether or not an applicant from one of these groups was eligible to naturalize was left to the courts. Legal scholar Cheryl Harris argues that, quote, the right to exclude was the central principle of whiteness as identity. And she continues, whiteness has been characterized not by any inherent unifying characteristic, but by the exclusion of others deemed to be not white. Citizenship was perhaps the most significant domain in which this right to exclude was exercised. Why? Because to be ineligible for citizenship meant being ineligible to hold land, and in most states it also meant being ineligible to hold professional licenses, such as those needed to practice law or medicine, which is to say that policing eligibility for citizenship was the most effective way to exclude non-whites from any means by which they might acquire power, also in the form of wealth, or have more say in their own governance. When the naturalization case of an Ottoman subject, Tom Ellis, a Syrian Maronite from Palestine, came up in an Oregon court in 1910, a lawyer for the government tried to argue against Syrians' eligibility by claiming that only white Europeans, rather than all Caucasians, should be admitted to the U.S. polity. The rationale given was that non-European subjects of a Muslim Ottoman sultan were products of a despotic regime, and they might not be prepared for Republican government. In other words, the lawyer tried to make Ottoman subjects visible to the U.S. state as subjects unfit for citizenship to be excluded from naturalization on the grounds of political history and culture, even though they would have been classified as Caucasian, and therefore should have been admissible by race. Judge Wolverton rejected the argument and granted Ellis citizenship, insisting that he was exactly the type of person Congress had intended to become a citizen. He spoke English, he was a practicing Christian, of good morals, sober, and industrious. Moreover, according to Wolverton, there was no ambiguity about the significance of the term white, and Ellis was, quote, possessed of the highest qualities which go to make an excellent citizen, was well disposed towards the principles and policies of this government, a good, highly respected citizen of the community. So in foregrounding good morals and respectability, Judge Wolverton relied on cultural arguments and made clear that the debates over whiteness were always about more than racial classification. Now, the petition forms eventually submitted by the Cartozian brothers for naturalization all state that they are male, white, and have dark complexions. All the brothers, as you can see here, they checked white on their World War I draft registration cards among the available categories of white, Negro, Oriental, Indian citizen, and Indian non-citizen. Hofsip was naturalized without incident in Oregon in 1918. Here he is in a news item in an issue of the Morning Oregonian from 1919, introducing the local members of the Rotary Club to the public, right? The paper gives us a brief description of each business leader. One fishes on his porch, the other has just returned from Australia, And the owner of the lumber yard believes firmly in the efficiency of women laborers. Very important things we need to know about our local Rotary Club members. Josep Cartozian, referred to by his initials, is introduced as a first-class citizen, right? First-class citizen, a term which should immediately give us pause, of course, for it implies that not all citizens are equal. So first-class citizen and a leader in patriotic work is H.O. Cartozian, who can hardly be blamed for his business, which is selling Oriental rugs, right? Now, a year later, in 1920, his older brother, Aram Cartozian, was naturalized in Washington state, again without incident. For Thanksgiving 1922, the Cartozians produced an ad that juxtaposed the sign of the camel with imagery of the Pilgrims and expressed their thankfulness for, quote, joining the free-minded, self-defending people of this blessed USA, which we now claim as our own dear home. The same caravan of camels in the Thanksgiving ad, you can see, continues and reappeared in their end-of-year ad, illustrating their impressive trajectory from 1906 to 1923. Tateusz Cartozian applied for naturalization in the spring of 1923. The point I'm trying to make is they would have had no reason to think that his application would not go as smoothly as his first-class citizen brothers. However, the decade since Judge Wolverton's 1910 Ellis decision had seen increased nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. One manifestation of this was the increased confusion about the grounds on which various immigrant groups could be considered eligible for naturalization. So, just before Thanksgiving 1922, in Ozawa versus the United States, the Supreme Court had declared that Japanese were categorically ineligible for citizenship. The decision was made based on scientific opinion. White person was determined to be synonymous with a person of the Caucasian race. Since no anthropological authority classified the Japanese as belonging to the Caucasian race, Ozawa was denied naturalization. Okay, so white has to be a racial category, scientifically proven. Yet a few months later, in February 1923, just after Tateusz Cartozian had filed his petition to naturalize, the same Supreme Court rescinded Bhagat Singh Thind's citizenship, which had been granted in 1920 by the U.S. District Court of Oregon, even though Thind was definitely Caucasian according to scientific categories. The very same court where Tateusz Cartozian hoped to naturalize had emphasized that Thind was a high-caste Hindu who had had an honorable career in the U.S. military. But when the case was challenged, the Supreme Court excluded Thind on the basis that the meaning of the term Caucasian was not sufficiently clear and was a word unknown to the average American, what the court referred to as the common man. So the words free white person are words of common speech to be interpreted in accordance with the understanding of the common man, synonymous with the word Caucasian, only as that word is popularly understood. Are you confused yet? Because I certainly would have been. It followed for the Supreme Court that the Asiatics were not free white persons according to an imagined common man's imagined common knowledge. The overturning of the Thind decision drew attention to Tateusz Cartozian's naturalization case on May 17, 1923. The Morning Oregonian story that appeared the day after began, whether an Armenian, although generally recognized as a member of the Caucasian race, is a white man within the meaning of the law and eligible to naturalization, was the point raised in federal Judge Bean's court yesterday when Tateusz O. Cartozian, local rug merchant, rug merchant applied for citizenship. So, in a bizarre coincidence, exactly 17 years to the day after his Ottoman expatriation photograph had been processed in Sebastia, Tadeusz Cartozian had been told to bring his family to the court, quote, so that the court might judge for itself if the man and his family was white. This time, however, the Cartozians were hoping to be made visible to the state in order that their difference from other Americans be deemed invisible, so that they could exit the marked category of Asiatic and join the ranks of the unmarked. Cartozian's wife and children, quote, all distinctly American, though a trifle olive-complexioned, filed to the front of the courtroom in which the citizenship cases of almost 70 immigrants were being decided. Most of the petitioners were of European background. 2 Hindus had already been deemed not white and therefore ineligible for citizenship in accordance with the recent Supreme Court decision on the Thind case. Tadeusz Cartozian's family approached the bench at the same time as a Syrian man, Saliba Kail, and his family. Though the Syrian man's wife and children were carrying small American flags, Kail's petition was denied on the basis of his illiteracy. The newspaper article states that Kail burst into tears upon learning that he could not become an American citizen. The Oregonian article sets up the contrast between the Kail and Cartozian families. With Cartozian, the government could find no fault except from the racial angle. The merchant satisfies all the demands of the court. The family, well-dressed and prosperous, differing not one bit from the average American family. While the article ends by listing by name and nationality the 62 others who were granted citizenship, the headline makes clear that the focus had been on whether or not Tadeusz Cartozian would be recognized as an American citizen. As you can see, the headline was T.O. Cartozian is admitted. Perhaps no 2 ads make clearer the Cartozians' understanding of the debates around race and the stakes involved than the one placed in the Sunday Oregonian the week before the family appeared in court for Tadeusz to naturalize, and a version of the same image with different copy that appeared just 10 days later. The image of rows of Muslim men bent over in prayer is confusing unless seen as visually setting the Christian Cartozians apart from the faceless Muslim Ottoman subjects who bow to a despotic sultan, the kind of subject who can only obey and therefore are unfit for citizenship. The second ad, so that appeared after he was naturalized, highlights, quote, the established fact that the Cartozians' general reputation had received the strongest endorsement, as if the Cartozians themselves were directly invoking common knowledge as the grounds for this endorsement. How are we doing on time? We good? Okay, keep going. So, he gets naturalized May 17, 1923. The naturalization inspector sent the Morning Oregonian newspaper story along with his report to Washington the very next day. And in November 1923, the Secretary of Labor decided to test the Cartozian case in federal courts. Perhaps in recognition of all that was at stake, the Cartozians abandoned the advertising image of praying Muslim hordes and retreated to the familiar Christian imagery of shepherds. Moreover, the kneeling camel was replaced by the image of a man riding a camel. That advertisements bearing this Cartozian camel trademark continued throughout the years of the trial suggests that the Cartozian family were not concerned that their visibility as Oriental experts might mark them as Asiatic, hence ineligible for citizenship. They continued advertising at exactly the same rapid pace. Perhaps the advertisements continued not only because they brought in business, but because, along with the Pittock Block storefront, they kept the Cartozians in a state of visibility, not as marked minorities, but as a prominent part of the fabric of Portland, already well-established citizens of the community. So their deft expertise in peddling exoticism itself served as proof of how fully assimilated they were to life in America. In fact, the Cartozian camel never genuflected again. And instead of established in 1906, going forward, each ad indicated that the symbol, so here, let's see, where do we have it here? On the bottom right, that the symbol, a rider on a camel, had been, quote, trademarked in the U.S. Patent Office. The camel in the Pittock building was endorsed by the U.S. government, and full-page ads ran in the fall of 1923 and emphasized the span of their rug empire. So this is a half-page version, but there were several full-page versions, right? So you can see the sort of reach of the Cartozians from the mythical East to Fifth Avenue, and as we know, beyond. The ads that appeared for Thanksgiving 1923, and then on the first day of 1924, exhibit great optimism about the future, always expressed in the language of commercial success, and show the Cartozian camel having arrived in America, a fantastical oriental cowboy figuratively conquering the nation, right? With the rays of the sun glorifying him. The Cartozian family was once again in court in May 1924, perhaps foreseeing that much depended on how he might be perceived by the common man, or perhaps as a result of having been paraded along with his family for the eyes of the judge. A photograph of Tadeusz Cartozian with his daughters Hazel and Ori appeared in the April 8, 1924 Morning Oregonian alongside an article about the expert testimonies being given on their behalf. Now, I do not know whether the photograph was the paper's idea or if it was suggested by Tadeusz Cartozian himself in anticipation of the trial. During the actual trial, a few weeks later, it was indeed Tadeusz's daughters and not his sons who were asked to take the stand and prove how well they had assimilated into American society. The article accompanying the photograph referred back to earlier racial prerequisite cases. The government contends that all Asiatics are barred from citizenship because they do not come under the classification that the man on the street understands as white. Now, whether or not the proverbial man on the street recognized them as white, Oregonian readers and others on the streets of Portland had had ample opportunity to see Cartozian faces and recognize them as good and highly respected citizens of the community. So there had been along the years several small notices notifying the public that Josep Cartozian would lecture on Oriental carpets, or that Tadeusz's daughter Funduk Hazel would demonstrate the use of the loom, or that rare antique rugs would be exhibited in the art museum, courtesy of the Cartozians, which is to say the Cartozians were a regular feature in Portland news. Now, in contrast to the Cartozians' prosperity, highly visible nationwide fundraising campaigns had familiarized the American public with images of starving Armenian children. Locally, the Cartozian name was associated with the Armenian relief effort, as the newspaper had run a photograph showing Cartozian children singing with others at a fundraiser for the Armenian relief campaign of 1916. However, newspaper coverage of the Cartozians had also highlighted their allegiance towards America. During World War I, Tadeusz's daughter Hazel Cartozian was very active in fundraising for Liberty bonds, and her photograph had appeared several times in the paper alongside articles about her patriotic service. She represented America in the pageant of nations celebrating the Allied victory in the First World War. The Oregonian and other Oregon papers had also covered the harrowing escape from the Ottoman Empire following the 1915 genocide of the oldest brother, Philippos Cartozian, who had remained behind all these years to supply the carpets for the business. Not only did the newspapers publish a profile of Philippos, but they also printed several small stories about Narcissus, his young son, who had traveled by himself and arrived first, and as well as covering the entire family's safe arrival in Portland in 1920, thanks to the help of the Masons. Now, the photograph of Tadeusz Cartozian and his daughters did not appear in the paper as an illustration of them originally gaining citizenship, nor alongside news of the final decision in 1925. It didn't even appear on the day that the trial began in May 1924. Rather, it was published on the day that several expert witnesses from scientific communities provided depositions for the case. The newspaper photograph was meant to illustrate the scientific classification of the Cartozians as Caucasian. It also once again paraded the family for others' inspection and effectively provided photographic proof of the family's whiteness for the common man, this time not an imagined common man, but the actual readers of the newspaper. And newspapers across the country carried this story. The Armenian community came to the aid of Tadeusz Cartozian not only out of concern for a fellow Armenian, but because they were all implicated, right? So by 1924, there were some 52,000 persons of Armenian birth in America. 10,500 of them had already been naturalized as American citizens. Any decision in the Cartozian case would be retroactive and could potentially strip all Armenians actually residing in the United States of their citizenship. The article celebrating Tadeusz Cartozian's admission to citizenship the year prior had warned that should the decision be reversed, Armenian grape growers who owned thousands of acres of farmland in California could find themselves ineligible to own land. Moreover, the Cable Act passed by Congress in 1922 had allowed women to retain their citizenship if they married an alien, but underscored that any woman who married an alien ineligible for citizenship shall cease to be a citizen of the United States, right? So had Tadeusz Cartozian's naturalization been overturned, financial, professional, and even marital prospects of many Armenians could have changed drastically overnight. Erlene Craver draws attention to the fact that the threat of losing eligibility for citizenship must have been particularly distressing for Armenian communities reeling from the 1915 genocide and the recent foreclosure of the possibility of the establishment of an independent Armenian nation. It had been promised as a part of the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, but not included in the 1923 Lausanne Treaty. Moreover, the 1924 Immigration Act set a quota on immigration, and with few exceptions, banned immigrants who were never going to be eligible for citizenship from entering the United States at all. So the Cartozian case was of key importance to the global Armenian diaspora, as it would not only potentially change the status of Armenians already in the United States, but it could potentially close the doors on needy Armenian refugees planning to come to America. So I've mentioned both the Ozawa and Thin cases before, right? And it made it clear that even in the highest court of the land, racial prerequisite cases could be decided differently according to different rationales, right? When the trial was actually held May 8th, 9th, 1924, what was emphasized was that the Cartozians had assimilated into American domestic life. And furthermore, they were readily welcomed into exclusive organizations such as Masonic lodges that abided by strict color lines. Tateus Cartozian himself was quoted in the paper saying that in 18 years of living in America, he had never been discriminated against because of race or nationality. He was greatly surprised that anyone was contending that Armenians were not white, given that 2 of his brothers had been admitted to Masonic lodges. So Cartozian appealed to the court on the grounds that he had not been seen as marked in any way by organizations known for discriminating against non-whites, right? The judge, the same judge who had stated in the Ellis case that clearly the meaning of white was clear and not worthy of commentary, and had granted Thin citizenship in Oregon before it was overturned, was the same judge overseeing the Cartozian case. As the Cartozian case came to a close, the prosecuting attorney stressed, quote, "It is the contention of the government that it makes no difference whether a man is a Caucasian or not, or what the racial and language history of his people may be, if the man on the street does not recognize him as white." Judge Wolverton is quoted in the paper as having interjected and said, "I don't really appreciate the rule of the Supreme Court that a white person is to be determined by what people on the street say. That does not seem to be a rule of strong character to me." Nonetheless, he took more than a year to make a decision on the Cartozian case. I can only imagine what a year of extreme anxiety that must have been, not only for the Cartozian family, but for all Armenian communities. On July 17, 1925, addressing both scientific evidence and common knowledge in his ruling, Judge Wolverton found for the defendants on 3 grounds. Armenian in Asia Minor are of Alpine stock, of European persuasion. 2, they are white persons as commonly recognized in speech of common usage and as popularly understood and interpreted in this country by our forefathers and by the community at large, covering all bases. And 3, they amalgamated readily with the white races, including the white people of the United States. Tateus Cartozian citizenship stood. Now, the months afterwards must have continued to be very anxiety-provoking because the expectation was always that it would be taken to the Supreme Court as prior cases had. And despite such rumors, however, the ruling was never challenged. So in conclusion, crafting a positive public image always makes good business sense. But advertising takes on different significance at a time when the state declares that an entire group's eligibility for naturalization allegedly hinges on whether or not the man on the street, the common man, recognizes him as white or not. So while official photography played a role in mediating their belonging and exclusion, the Cartozians turned to mass media to represent themselves to the common man, and by extension to the state. Their advertisements reveal a very knowing mode of address, right? Otherness is not erased entirely, but it's rendered in a particular commodified and domesticated visual form, alongside performances of belonging in order to secure the legal invisibility of whiteness. When citizenship depends on cultural competency and common perception, public representations become essential for claims of belonging. Unlike other parts of the country, given that there were so few Armenian families in the Pacific Northwest, the Cartozians and their mass-mediated advertisements had the potential to have outsized impact on popular perceptions. So, in a finale that was extraordinary to me, in the height of the uncertainty surrounding Armenians' eligibility to naturalize, right, during what must have been a very long year in which they awaited a decision, rather than retreating from Asiatic associations, in September 1924, the Cartozians announced their newly remodeled Oriental Rug House, featuring masterpieces of the Far East with great fanfare. The remodel itself was covered in the Oregonian, with special attention drawn to the Oriental front. The Cartozians' registered trademark mounted camel appeared in bas-relief on Washington Street. Here you have a frontal view. For the next several years, even after the storefront was moved, the bas-relief was moved with it, Cartozian ads became much more uniform, almost all of them featuring the Pitak Block Oriental storefront, like you see here. This is an Orient that is fully domesticated to the American project of commerce and woven into the fabric of the modern city and middle-class consumption. This ad highlights the opulence of both the Cartozian establishment and its customers. A particularly stylish woman in a fur coat to the left, approaching the store, looks not unlike Hazel Cartozian as she appeared next to her father with her fox about her shoulders in the 1924 newspaper photograph. So in their 1906 portrait, the Cartozians lost recognition as nationals, but gained mobility by becoming visible to the Ottoman state. They then had to navigate ways of becoming legally invisible as Asians so as to be able to naturalize as US citizens. Ironically, one of the ways by which they were able to do this was by deftly wielding Orientalist stereotypes in the mass media sphere. In their advertising, the Cartozians performed cultural knowledge of the desires and expectations of white Americans, positioning themselves as brokers who could offer exoticism, but in a palatable form, already packaged for white middle-class consumers. Their invisibility was achieved by actively managing forms of visibility in which their Asianness was not swept under the carpet. Indeed, the Cartozians gained both financial, social, and legal standing precisely by constantly and bombastically advertising rather than hiding their Oriental connections. It was, in fact, the hypervisibility of the Oriental carpet and camel, an incessant representation of an exotic mythical Orient that helped them secure desired legal invisibility. I want to make what to me is a very important point, which is that I never set out to study the history of racial prerequisite cases. I came to this history by unfolding an Ottoman expatriation photograph that I encountered in the Ottoman state a decade ago. I had no idea that Tateos Cartozian was somebody who would go on to make headlines in US papers. I merely made a commitment to follow wherever these photographs led, to try to understand something of the lives of the individuals in the photographs, right? Over this past decade, I sought out the descendants of every individual in every photograph, right? So that's over 400 individuals. The highlights of my scholarly career have been the collaborative discoveries made looking together with these descendants. Now, tonight, I've told you the story of the Cartozians. And through unfolding this particular portrait of unbelonging, I have learned much. But I have learned as much from many other families. So I could have told you about the Cartozians, the Chapurians, the Simonians, the Corallians, or many others. The Muradians, let me not forget. Maybe on another occasion I'll be invited to do so. But I want to emphasize that I'm grateful to all the families from whom I have learned so much. And I want to end by returning to Professor Vartan Grigoryan, specifically his memoir, The Road to Home. And I hope you will see why. I'm going to read a short piece from the memoir. Professor Grigoryan writes, "My position this is at the University of Pennsylvania, was funded by a distinguished trustee of Penn, Sarkis Tarzian, a 1937 graduate of the Moore School of the university, an eminent scientist, engineer, and entrepreneur. Mr. Tarzian, an Armenian American, had pledged $2 million, provided the university could find an appropriate scholar who would teach Armenian history and culture. I was coming to Penn with a dowry. It was agreed that I would be appointed as professor of history, professor of South Asian history, and Tarzian professor of Armenian and Caucasian history. I was very amused when one of my students once asked whether I was teaching about the Caucasians, as in whites. I hope he would have chuckled at his namesake lecture being about Caucasians, as in whites. I also wish I could have shared with him this portrait in the collection of Project SAVE, which I identified as an Ottoman expatriation photograph. It shows the Tarzian family of Harpert in 1907, and the young boy on the right is none other than Sarkis Tarzian, who would grow up to give UPenn the dowry to appoint Vartan Grigoryan the Tarzian professor of Armenian and Caucasian history. I would have loved to have had a conversation with Professor Grigoryan about this photograph and all the portraits of unbelonging. Thank you.